The stagecoach rocked violently as it hit another rut, the wheels groaning under the weight of the journey and the merciless terrain of the West. Abigail Greenfield clutched her carpetbag tighter against her stomach, the well-worn letter folded inside already crumpled and stained from the 1,000 times she'd read it. She pressed her forehead against the cracked glass, watching the endless ribbon of dust unfurl behind them, a serpent made of earth and regret. The letter's words still burned in her mind. I seek a good woman, stout of heart and frame, for partnership in life and land. It had seemed like Providence, a miracle delivered through the frail hands of the postman back in New York. In that moment she believed a new life was not only possible but inevitable. Somewhere beyond the endless plains and jagged mountains waited a man who would see her not as a burden, not as a joke, but as a prize. The thought should have brought her comfort, but Abigail's fingers twisted the letter until the paper threatened to tear. Her mind betrayed her with ugly memories, cruel whispers behind embroidered fans, dances where she stood like a forgotten statue against the wall, suitors who sneered once they glimpsed her full figure. Too much woman, one man had muttered to another, their laughter punching holes through her composure. The driver barked over his shoulder that they'd be arriving at Coyote Hollow within the hour. Abigail swallowed hard. Beyond the window, the horizon shimmered with heat. Her heart did the same, part hope, part terror. When the coach lurched to a stop, she stepped down carefully, boots striking the dusty ground with an awkward finality. The town sprawled before her. A few crooked buildings leaning like old men, a saloon with swinging doors and a mercantile with a sun-bleached sign. Coyote Hollow smelled of horses, sweat, and opportunity. She straightened her skirts and dabbed the sweat from her brow with a handkerchief. Somewhere among these dusty souls waited Mr. Daniel Finch, her future. A man approached, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat tilted low over his eyes. His coat was fine, too fine for this hardscrabble town, and he had the swagger of someone who thought the world owed him a favor. Abigail's heart clanged like a church bell. She smoothed her hair and stepped forward, offering her best smile. "Mr. Finch?" she ventured, voice trembling. He glanced at her with lazy indifference, eyes flickering up and down her frame like a man appraising livestock. His mouth curled into a sneer before he even bothered answering. "You Abigail?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He snorted and turned to the driver as if she weren't even there. "Ain't what the letter said." Her face flushed, her hands knotting in the fabric of her skirt. I can work. I'm strong. I sew, cook, tend to animals." Finch waved a hand dismissively as though swatting away a gnat. "I said stout, not overgrown. You misled me." The words hit harder than any fist. Around them, townsfolk slowed their chores to stare, their eyes sharpening with mean curiosity. Abigail wanted the earth to crack open and swallow her whole. "I didn't mislead anyone," she whispered. He chuckled cruelly, tipping his hat back to reveal pale, contemptuous eyes. "I ain't taking you. Find someone else to feed ya." And just like that, he turned and strode away, boots kicking up cruel little puffs of dust in her face. For a moment, Abigail stood frozen, the world tilting crazily around her. She couldn't breathe, the sky was too wide, the ground too uncertain. A child snickered nearby. An old woman clucked her tongue. Somewhere, a dog barked, indifferent to her humiliation. Hot tears blurred her vision. She stumbled toward the mercantile, anywhere but here under their accusing gazes. The door creaked mournfully as she pushed inside, drawing a few more looks she pretended not to see. Inside, the smell of old flour and kerosene hit her nose. She clutched the nearest shelf for balance, blinking rapidly. Behind the counter, a wiry man with a tobacco-stained beard eyed her warily. "Help you, miss?" No thank you." Her voice cracked. She backed out into the street, the sun like a hammer against her skull. She didn't remember how her feet moved, only that they did, carrying her past the saloon, the blacksmith, the jeering glances, the pitying looks. Her chest tightened with each step until it felt like she might break apart entirely. She didn't notice when the town gave way to scrubland, or when the packed earth turned to wild grasses that brushed against her skirts. Only when she reached the edge of the woods did she stop, lungs burning, vision spinning. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, gasping raggedly. The letter slipped from her bag and fluttered away on the breeze like a ghost. All her hopes, worth no more than scraps. She wept then, great heaving sobs that tore free from the cage she tried to lock them in. She wept for every unkind word, every dismissal, every cruel laugh. She wept for the foolish dream she had dared to cradle in her heart. Tears mingled with the dust on her cheeks, painting her a woman undone. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the prairie. A cool wind stirred the grasses. Abigail hugged her arms around herself, shivering despite the heat. Night was coming fast, and with it, danger. She became aware of a presence. At first, she thought it was her imagination, born from fear and exhaustion. But then she heard it, a heavy tread, deliberate yet cautious, crunching the brittle grass. Heart hammering, Abigail scrambled to her feet, swiping at her tear-streaked face. She whirled around, fists clenched uselessly. A man stood just at the edge of the tree line, half swallowed by the deepening shadows. His silhouette was massive, broad-shouldered, hat slung low. Not moving. Watching. Panic surged up her throat. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her skirts. "Easy, miss," came a voice low and rough yet oddly gentle. "Ain't fixin' to hurt you." The stranger stepped forward into the dying light. He was enormous, built like the very trees that loomed behind him. His beard was thick, dark, and wild as the forest itself. His clothes were plain but well-made. His boots looked worn from honest labor, not vanity. Despite herself, Abigail froze. Something in his posture, cautious, respectful, stayed her flight. "You're a long ways from town," he said, voice rumbling like distant thunder. She opened her mouth to answer, but only a soft whimper came out. The man's gaze softened. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Name's Jack McGraw," he offered. "Got a cabin not far. Safer there than here when the coyotes start prowlin'. The thought of being alone in the wilderness overnight made Abigail's blood turn to ice. Yet every instinct she had screamed caution. This was a stranger after all. A man bigger than any she had ever seen. Could she trust him? Jack seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a deliberate step back, giving her space, lowering his hands to show they were empty. "You can follow me at your pace," he said quietly. "Or stay here and hope the wolves don't catch your scent. Choice is yours, miss." The wind picked up, whispering through the tall grasses like unseen voices. In the distance, a coyote's mournful howl split the coming dark. Abigail squared her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full, ample height. She was tired of being afraid. She had crossed half a continent already. She had survived worse than loneliness, worse than cruelty. Without a word, she lifted her chin and took a step toward Jack McGraw. The hint of a smile touched his mouth, not mocking but warm, approving. He turned without another word, leading her into the gathering twilight, toward the dense, wild heart of the forest. As the trees swallowed them, Abigail cast one last glance over her shoulder at the town of Coyote Hollow, now little more than a smear of false promises against the horizon. She did not look back again. The forest closed around them like a cathedral of towering pines, the air damp and rich with the scents of earth and moss. Abigail stumbled after Jack, her boots snagging on twisted roots and fallen branches. Twilight seeped through the trees in thin silver veins, painting everything in muted shadow. Each step deeper into the woods pulled her farther from the life she had known, farther from the sting of humiliation that still burned on her skin. Jack moved with an easy, grounded grace, as though the land itself bent to accommodate his weight. Occasionally he glanced back to make sure she hadn't fallen too far behind. His presence, though massive, carried no menace. If anything, he seemed to be holding himself smaller, as if careful not to frighten her. They crossed a shallow creek where Abigail's skirts caught the water and clung to her legs, chilling her to the bone. Jack paused midstream, offering a thick, calloused hand without a word. After a brief hesitation she took it. His grip was warm and solid, steadying her with a touch so gentle it surprised her. In the few seconds their hands met, something unspoken passed between them, a tenuous bridge spanning two wounded hearts. A clearing opened up ahead, revealing a stout log cabin tucked against the shoulder of a low hill. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, and the faint golden flicker of lamplight spilled from the windows. The cabin looked rough but sturdy, as if it had been there forever, holding its ground against time and storm alike. Jack led her to the door and swung it open with a casual push. "Come on in," he said. "Ain't fancy, but it's dry and warm." Inside, the space was small but welcoming. A fire crackled merrily in the stone hearth, filling the room with heat and the comforting aroma of burning pine. Rough-hewn shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of preserves, tools, and bundles of dried herbs. A table and two chairs sat in the center, their surfaces scarred from years of use. Against the far wall was a narrow cot, neatly made. Jack set his hat on a peg and moved to stir the pot hanging over the fire. The smell of stew, rich and savory, filled the air, making Abigail's empty stomach rumble. "Sit yourself down," Jack said, ladling stew into two battered tin bowls. He slid one across the table toward her. Abigail hesitated, then lowered herself into a chair. The wood creaked under her, but the chair held firm. She picked up a spoon with trembling fingers, the simple gesture of being offered food almost too much after the day's brutal cruelty. They ate in silence for a time, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the pop of the fire. Abigail sneaked glances at Jack over her bowl. Up close he was even more rugged. His hands scarred, his arms thick with muscle, his beard unruly. Yet there was a calmness to him, a steadiness that seemed rare in a world built on bravado. After a while, Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms loosely over his chest. His eyes, a deep shade of green touched by gold, regarded her without judgment. "You runnin' from something?" he asked. Abigail set down her spoon carefully. She could lie, but what would be the point? Her shame was already writ large across her face, her very presence here proof of her failure. "I came out west to marry a man," she said, voice rough. "He took one look at me and changed his mind." Jack's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing, waiting. Abigail forced herself to continue. "He said I misled him. That I wasn't what he ordered." She laughed bitterly, the sound raw and broken. "Like I'm a crate of apples gone bad in the shipping." Jack's jaw flexed, but he still said nothing, letting the silence hold space for her words. "I didn't lie," she said fiercely. "I'm strong. I'm kind. I work hard." But none of that mattered once he saw. She gestured helplessly at herself. Jack drummed his fingers once against the table. "That man's a damn fool," he said simply. The words hit her like a bomb, unexpected and healing. She blinked rapidly, willing back the tears that threatened to rise again. Jack shifted in his chair, suddenly awkward. "Ain't nobody's worth measured by what they fit into, Abigail. Folks out here need strength. Grit. Not some scrawny dandy too delicate to lift a feed sack." She laughed softly, surprised by the rough humor and even more by the warmth that stirred in her chest. Jack smiled faintly. "Sides, I reckon the wolves would not have minded a scrawny feller. They'd have eaten him right quick." Another laugh bubbled out, more genuine this time. The tension in her shoulders eased just a little. The fire crackled on, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the night deepened, punctuated by the distant calls of owls and the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. "You're welcome to stay here," Jack said, voice low. "Long as you need. Safe roof. Hot meals. I ain't a skin for nothin' in return." Abigail studied him carefully. His offer sounded honest, but honesty was a currency rarely spent freely in her experience. Yet everything about Jack, from his plain words to the open way he met her gaze, whispered of trust. Thank you," she said. "I don't know what I'll do next, but, thank you." Jack nodded once as if that settled things. He rose and moved to stoke the fire, his bulk casting a large, comforting shadow. "I'll take the floor," he said gruffly. "Cot's yours." "No, I couldn't possibly." "My house," he said, cutting her off gently. "My rules." There was no arguing with that kind of stubborn kindness. Abigail rose from the table and moved toward the cot, peeling off her dust-choked outer layers. Jack handed her a rough wool blanket, and she clutched it gratefully. Settling onto the cot, she marveled at how quickly exhaustion claimed her. The day's sorrows and fears weighed down her limbs like lead. She watched Jack settle himself near the fire, a rifle within easy reach, his hat pulled low over his eyes. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Abigail felt a fragile thread of safety weave its way into her frayed soul. As sleep closed in, she heard Jack's voice, low and rumbling in the darkness. "Don't fret none, Abigail. West's got a way of mendin' what's been broke." The fire's glow blurred into golden mist, and Abigail surrendered to sleep, her dreams filled with towering forests, crackling hearths, and the steady, watchful presence of a man who, against all odds, had seen her not with disdain, but with quiet, unwavering acceptance. The dawn would bring new troubles, that much she knew. But for tonight, in this cabin deep in the wild, she was simply a woman with a beating heart and a fighting chance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like an old song. Somewhere far off, wolves howled into the darkness. But none dared come near the cabin where a giant stood watch and a broken heart dared to heal. And from the edge of the woods, unseen but keenly felt, danger stirred, drawing closer with the rising moon. The morning light broke through the trees in pale ribbons, casting a soft gold over the cabin walls. Abigail woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the crackling sounds of bacon frying in a skillet. For a moment she lay still, drinking in the warmth, the unfamiliar sense of safety. But reality seeped back quickly, dragging yesterday's wounds to the surface. She sat up slowly, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Across the cabin, Jack moved with easy efficiency, flipping bacon with the edge of a knife, his broad back to her. He wore only a loose shirt tucked into worn trousers, the muscles in his arms flexing as he worked. There was something profoundly grounding about him, as if he was hewn from the very bones of the earth itself. "Coffee's hot," he said without turning. Abigail rose, smoothing her skirts. She moved toward the table, feeling awkward, heavy in her own skin. Jack poured her a mug and set it down without ceremony, then dropped a slab of bacon onto a tin plate and pushed it toward her. "You sleep all right?" he asked, finally looking her way. She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "Better than I have in a long time." Jack grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. He pulled up a chair, settling across from her with his own plate. For a while they ate in companionable silence. The food was simple, but it tasted like salvation. Abigail found herself watching him more than she meant to. His quiet movements, the thoughtful way he chewed, the way he glanced out the window between bites as if listening to something only he could hear. Finally she set her fork down, steeling herself. "I can't stay here forever," she said softly. Jack's green-gold eyes locked onto hers. "Wasn't expecting you to. But I don't know where else to go." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her with a gaze as sharp as a whetted blade. "You got a good head. Good hands. World's bigger in one lousy town." A small laugh escaped her lips, brittle as dry grass. "The world don't exactly open its arms to women like me, Jack." He tilted his head slightly. "Maybe you just ain't been in the right part of it yet." Before she could respond, a sharp, distant crack shattered the morning calm. Abigail stiffened. Jack was already on his feet, moving to the door in 2 quick strides. He eased it open, scanning the trees. "What is it?" she whispered, heart hammering. Jack held up a hand for silence. The woods beyond the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Then came another sound, closer this time. The unmistakable crunch of boots on brittle underbrush. Jack's hand dropped to the rifle propped near the door. He motioned Abigail back toward the hearth, away from the windows. She obeyed, her throat tight, her body rigid with fear. She watched as Jack positioned himself just inside the doorway, a shadow among shadows, the rifle cradled in his arms like an extension of his will. More footsteps. Voices, low and laughing, punctuated with ugly sharpness. Abigail's stomach knotted. Whoever was coming, they weren't friendly. Jack waited, still as stone, until the first figure broke through the trees. A man, lean and mean-looking, his face half hidden under a grimy hat. 2 more followed, rough men with hard eyes and guns slung low on their hips. The leader spat into the dirt and called out, "Morning, neighbor. Fine little cabin you got there." Jack said nothing. The man stepped closer, hands held loosely away from his sides in a mockery of peace. "Me and my boys were just looking for a bit of hospitality. Ain't that right, boys?" The others chuckled, the sound oily and sharp. Jack shifted slightly, the rifle steady. "Ain't got nothing here for you." The leader's smile turned mean. "Ain't how it works, friend. You got supplies. Maybe some valuables. Maybe company." Abigail's blood went cold. The man's gaze slid toward the cabin windows, speculative and foul. Abigail pressed herself flatter against the wall, bow rising in her throat. Jack took a single step forward onto the porch. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Turn around. Walk away." For a moment the leader seemed to consider it. Then he laughed, a hard, barking sound, and reached for the pistol at his side. Jack moved faster. The rifle cracked, the shot shattering the air like thunder. The leader stumbled back with a scream, clutching his hand, blood pouring between his fingers. Chaos erupted. The 2 remaining men drew their guns, but Jack was already moving, reloading with the precision of long practice. Another shot rang out, sending one outlaw sprawling into the dirt. The last man fired wildly, the bullet splintering the cabin's porch post inches from Jack's head. Abigail flinched, heart in her mouth. Jack didn't hesitate. He charged forward like an avalanche, covering the distance between him and the gunman in 3 strides. The man barely had time to scream before Jack slammed the rifle butt into his face, dropping him like a sack of grain. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the injured leader writhing in the dirt. Jack loomed over him, the rifle aimed square at his chest. "Tell your friends," Jack said, voice low and full of iron. "You come back here, you don't walk away." The leader nodded frantically, dragging himself to his feet and limping into the trees without a backward glance. The other 2 men followed, one half carrying the other, leaving behind a trail of blood and fear. Jack watched them go until the wood swallowed them, then lowered the rifle with a long, slow breath. Abigail sagged against the wall, legs trembling. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Jack turned, his face carved in grim lines. When he saw her, some of the hardness melted away. "You all right?" She nodded jerkily, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Jack crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into a rough embrace. At first, she stiffened and used to such sudden closeness. But then she felt the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of him, the sheer reality of his presence anchoring her. Her hands clutched his shirt, and for a long moment she let herself be held. When she finally pulled back, Jack studied her with a gentleness that stole her breath. "World's full of men like them," he said quietly. "But it's full of better ones too." Tears burned at her eyes and she blinked them away fiercely. "I'm so tired of being afraid," she whispered. "You don't have to be," Jack said. "Not here." The simple conviction in his voice broke something open inside her. She realized with a jolt that she wasn't just afraid of the world, she was afraid of wanting too much. Of hoping. Of believing she could be wanted, needed, loved. Jack saw the struggle in her eyes and didn't push. He simply offered her space, safety, and the choice to trust. She swallowed hard, heart pounding. "I want to stay," she said, voice barely above a breath. Jack's answering smile was slow and fierce, like the sunrise clawing its way over a jagged ridge. "Good," he said simply. "You're where you belong." The fire crackled between them, casting long, golden shadows that danced across the walls. Abigail felt something shift inside her, a foundation being laid, brick by hard-won brick. Outside, the forest stood silent and watchful, a wild world that asked only for strength and resilience. Inside the cabin, 2 souls, both battered, both scarred, began to knit themselves together in the fragile, stubborn hope of something more. The danger had not passed. The road ahead would not be easy. But Abigail no longer faced it alone. And as she met Jack's steady gaze, she knew with a certainty as fierce as the beating of her heart. She never would again. Spring melted into summer in the mountains, and life, though hard, began to take on a rhythm, a cadence of sweat, laughter, and unexpected joy. Abigail threw herself into each new task with a determination that startled even her. There were fences to mend, fields to clear, gardens to plant. Jack taught her everything he knew, which was more than she'd ever imagined a man could carry inside him. At first, Abigail fumbled more than she succeeded. She split wood awkwardly, cooked bread that turned to bricks, and dropped eggs more often than she gathered them. But Jack never laughed at her failures. He showed her, patiently, over and over, until her hands toughened and her movements grew sure. And somewhere along the way the ache inside her chest, born of rejection, humiliation, fear, began to heal. They built more than just a life together. They built a partnership rooted in fierce respect. Jack never treated her like she was fragile or less than capable because of her size. If anything, he seemed to admire her strength, her resilience, the fire that had kept her going when so many others might have given up. One evening, after a long day hauling lumber from a nearby grove, Jack surprised her with a gift. A hand-carved rocking chair, smooth as river stones under her fingers. Abigail traced the intricate patterns he'd burned into the arms. Tiny wildflowers, mountain peaks, a pair of intertwined hearts. "It ain't much," he said, suddenly shy, the tips of his ears turning red. "It's beautiful," she whispered, sinking into it. The chair creaked comfortingly under her, cradling her like a promise. Jack grinned, boyish and unguarded. "Figured you earned a proper place to rest after working circles around me." Abigail laughed, a full, rich sound that startled even herself. She realized then how rare her laughter had been, how deeply buried her happiness had become, and how effortlessly Jack had coaxed it to the surface. Later, as dusk folded the sky into shades of purple and gold, they sat together on the porch, the sounds of the forest humming around them like a lullaby. Jack's hand brushed against hers, and when their fingers tangled, neither pulled away. In the quiet, Abigail found herself speaking truths she had hidden for too long. "I thought, when I came out here, that maybe no one would ever see me. Not really." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "Back home I was just a problem to be fixed. A disappointment. Too much of everything." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Back there maybe. But out here." He turned to her, his face open raw. "Out here you're everything I didn't know I was waiting for." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but she let them fall. There was no shame in them, not here. Not with him. Jack leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You're strong, Abigail. Fierce. Beautiful." His voice dropped, low and rough. You're the kind of woman who makes a man better just by standing beside him. When he kissed her, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was deep, reverent, a slow claiming of something sacred between them. Abigail kissed him back with everything she had, every scar, every dream, every piece of herself she had once been told was unworthy. The seasons shifted again. Summer's lushness gave way to the crisp sharpness of autumn. The days grew shorter, the air cooler, but the warmth between them never waned. Together they rebuilt the cabin stronger than before, adding a second room and a stone hearth. Abigail planted rows of vegetables, and Jack trapped and hunted, their larder filling steadily for the coming winter. The days were full of back-breaking labor, but each night they found comfort in each other's arms, in whispered promises and shared dreams. Still, danger never strayed far in the wild places. Word had spread about the cabin deep in the woods, a place rich with stores, protected by a man who'd already bloodied more than one nose. Raiders, desperate settlers, outlaws, they circled like vultures waiting for a weakness. It came on a night when the first frost clung silver to the grass. Abigail woke to the faint crackle of flames and the acrid sting of smoke. Heart-pounding, she shook Jack awake. "Fire," she gasped. He was up instantly, grabbing his rifle. Together they burst onto the porch, and saw the barn ablaze, the flames roaring higher with each passing second. Jack swore under his breath. They said it. Figures moved beyond the glow, 3, maybe 4 men, their faces hidden under scarves and hats. Jack pushed Abigail toward the cabin door. "Stay inside. Bar it tight." "No," she said fiercely, gripping his arm. "We stand together." He stared at her for a long moment, something like pride flickering through his eyes. Then he nodded once. The battle was brutal and fast. Jack moved like a force of nature, every shot deliberate, every movement honed. Abigail reloaded his spare rifle, her hand steady despite the terror clawing at her gut. One raider fell, clutching his leg and screaming. Another fled into the woods after a warning shot grazed his shoulder. The others, seeing their comrades fall, broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Jack doused the flames with every bucket of water they could muster, but the barn was lost. Still, they saved the livestock, the garden, the cabin, the heart of their life. When the fire finally died, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins, Jack turned to Abigail. Soot streaked his face and his shirt was torn, but his eyes shone with fierce, unbroken light. "You all right?" he rasped. She threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. "I'm better than all right. I'm alive. We're alive." Jack hugged her tight, lifting her off her feet for a moment. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I ain't ever lettin' you go," he said. "You're stuck with me," she said, laughing shakily. "Damn right I am." Under the bruised sky, surrounded by ash and ruin, they kissed, an unspoken vow that no fire, no enemy, no force in the world could break them apart. Winter came early that year, heavy and relentless. But inside the cabin, warmth blossomed. Abigail and Jack married in front of the hearth with only the trees and the mountains as their witnesses. She wore a simple dress sewn from the finest linen Jack could afford, and he carved their wedding bands himself, twisting silver wire into rugged circles that gleamed in the firelight. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Jack looked her straight in the eye and said, "You're my home, Abigail. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." She echoed the vow with her whole heart, her whole soul. Their days fell into a new rhythm, of surviving, thriving, and dreaming. They spoke of building a bigger house come spring, of planting orchards and maybe even starting a school for the scattered children of nearby homesteads. The world outside their valley remained hard and cruel, but it could not touch what they had built together. Love, real love, had taken root here, in the blood and sweat and stubborn hope of 2 people the world had once dismissed. It was not the life Abigail had dreamed of when she first answered the mail-order bride advertisement. It was something better, something she never even knew she was allowed to want. She was no longer a girl running from shame and rejection. She was a woman standing tall beside the man who saw her, chose her, cherished her without condition. And as the snow fell thick and silent over the forest, blanketing the scars of old battles, Abigail sat in her rocking chair, Jack beside her, and smiled into the fire's glow. Their love was not delicate or easy. It was forged like steel, tempered in fire, tested by wind and storm. It was a love that endured. And it was only just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps the spirit of the Wild West alive. The sun split the dry sky like a blade, casting long, jagged shadows across the wide-open plains. Dust curled behind a lone rider, his silhouette hard and angular against the burning blue. Jedediah McGraw, cattle baron of Bent Willow, wasn't a man prone to sentiment or second thoughts. He'd built his fortune with calloused hands, grit in his teeth, and a rifle always within reach. But as he rode toward the depot, something uneasy twisted in his gut. He was meeting his bride. A month earlier he'd agreed to marry a woman he'd never met, only seen her name on a letter and her uncle's shaky handwriting. Eleanor Albright, the niece of a down-on-his-luck rancher from East Texas. The deal was clean. In exchange for marrying her, Jed would acquire grazing rights on a fertile stretch of river-fed land. The rancher had no sons. Jed had no wife. Arranged marriages weren't unheard of out here, especially not for men like him, scarred, lonesome, and aging faster than his bones should allow. The rumors about Eleanor hadn't helped his mood. "They say she's got a face like an old boot," his foreman, Reese, had muttered over whiskey one night, chuckling meanly. Heard a preacher choked on his own tongue first time he saw her. Jed had grunted, unconvinced. "Don't need pretty. Need practical. Practical don't put fire in a man's belly. Pretty don't cook or herd cattle." Now, as he dismounted at the dusty station, Jed rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the strange sense that something was about to change. The train hissed and groaned to a halt, steam curling into the wind like ghost fingers. Passengers spilled out, merchants, miners, a woman with twin boys in tow. Then at the end she stepped down. Eleanor Albright. She wore a high-neck dress of dark green wool, worn at the sleeves, her posture ramrod straight. A wide-brimmed hat shielded her face, and a veil of sheer black lace fell just past her chin. He could see the faintest outline of a mouth, lips neither smiling nor frowning. She held a leather valise in one hand and a small revolver holstered at her hip. That caught his attention. Jed took 2 steps forward. "Miss Albright." Her voice was smooth, deeper than expected, with the kind of calm that didn't come easy. "Mr. McGraw. You travel light. I've learned not to carry more than I can shoot my way out with." He blinked. She added, "Shall we sign papers first or eat first? I've been on that train for 3 days and could murder a biscuit." He couldn't help the chuckle that slipped out. "Reckon we'll eat." They rode side by side in silence back to the ranch. The land around them was scorched dry, tall grass brown to brittle stems, sky empty of clouds for weeks. Jed couldn't read much from the angle of her face beneath the veil, but her posture never wavered. She didn't flinch when the wind blew hard or when they passed a line of vultures picking at a dead calf. She rode better than some of his hands. He wanted to ask why the veil, but the words stuck in his throat. He was a man who prided himself on not needing to ask things. Still, curiosity itched at him like a thorn in his boot. Back at the ranch house, Reese and the others gave her sidelong looks, trying not to stare. She ignored them entirely. In the dining room, she pulled her gloves off with clean precision. Her hands were pale, fingers long, a scar shaped like a crescent moon along one knuckle. "I trust the contract's ready," she said. Jed handed her the document. She signed without hesitation. He signed after her. No vows. No preacher. Just ink and dust and 2 names on paper. "Married then?" he said. "Looks that way," she replied. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange into the horizon, Jed stood on the porch, sipping black coffee. Inside, Eleanor moved with quiet confidence, unpacking her things and taking over the small guest bedroom without a word. She hadn't removed the veil. Not even once. Reese came out, scratching his stubble. "You see her yet?" "Seen enough. Word around town is she ain't exactly the looker. Word around town don't mean squat." "You curious?" Jed said nothing. Reese grinned. "Bet she's hidin' a second head under there. Reckon that'd make conversation more interestin'." When Reese laughed and walked off, Jed didn't join in. Something about Eleanor felt off. Not in the way Reese assumed. Not ugly or strange, but controlled. Like a coiled spring. Like someone who knew how to hide. That night, Jed passed by her room. A lantern flickered inside. Her silhouette moved across the thin curtain, deliberate, graceful. She paused as if sensing him watching. He knocked once. "Something wrong?" she asked through the door. "No," he said, hesitating. "Just figured we ought to talk. Being married and all." The door creaked open. She stood there, veil still in place. The lantern cast an amber halo around her head, but her face remained in shadow. She didn't smile. "What is it you want to say, Mr. McGraw?" Jed cleared his throat. "People been talking. About why you wear that veil. I'm sure they have. They say things I ain't inclined to believe." "Then don't." He leaned on the doorframe. You ashamed of something? No, she said. But I've learned that men don't always react well to seeing what's real. Jed frowned. You think I scare easy? No, she said softly now. I think you judge quick. Her hand lifted to the edge of the veil, then stopped. If you're looking for beauty, she said, you won't find it on my face. Better decide now if you want to back out. He didn't flinch. I ain't afraid of monsters, Miss Eleanor. She paused, lips barely visible through the mesh. I'm not a monster. But I've met them. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted the veil. Jed's breath caught. She wasn't ugly. Not even close. Her features were sharp, high cheekbones carved like canyon rock, full lips, storm gray eyes that seemed to pierce through the walls around his thoughts. But her face told stories, an old scar across her jawline, faded but angry, another along the edge of her temple. Not flaws. Proof. He stared, not in shock but in silence. I didn't lie, she said. I'm not what men expect. I've had to make sure of it. Jed didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, pretty don't matter to me. Her brow lifted. But you, he continued, you look like you survived a war. I did. They stood in silence, the wind pressing against the walls outside like a whisper of things to come. He stepped back from the door. You're welcome here, Eleanor. Long as you want to be. She nodded once. He turned, walked down the hall, and just before reaching his room, he heard her voice drift after him, quiet but laced with something heavy. Good night, Jedediah. He didn't sleep well. Not because of fear or doubt, but because he just realized the land might not be the wildest thing he'd ever tried to tame. And maybe, just maybe, he was the one in danger. The morning came with the scent of creosote and ash drifting on the wind, promising another dry, unforgiving day. Jedediah rose before the sun as he always did, but this time he paused outside the guest room, listening to the faint shuffle of Eleanor moving inside. She was already awake. He wasn't surprised. At breakfast, she joined the table with her sleeves rolled up and hair tied back, eyes sharp and clear. No veil, no curtain. The hands went quiet when she walked in, eggs halfway to their mouths, coffee cups paused midair. She met their stares with absolute stillness. Jed cleared his throat. This here's my wife, Eleanor. She's running the books now and overseeing the kitchen. Any man here got an issue with that can come see me. The men nodded, some slower than others, and resumed eating. Reese muttered something under his breath but didn't push it. Eleanor sat down without comment, spooned up her eggs, and asked if anyone had checked the fence line west of the ridge. No one answered, but Jed smiled faintly. She wasn't asking for approval. She was taking the reins. Over the next few days, Eleanor wove herself into ranch life with an unsettling ease. She mucked stalls with the new boys, walked the fence line with Jed, and corrected his ledgers with ruthless efficiency. Her penmanship was elegant, precise, like someone who once had formal schooling and then forgot how to care about showing it off. But it was her eyes that kept him on edge. Not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they missed nothing. She watched the ranch like a hawk circling overhead, calculating, measuring, waiting, and then there were the scars. Jed noticed them in fragments. A thin line just below her ear. A jagged mark across her ribs when the wind blew her shirt against her skin. He didn't ask. Not yet. But they haunted him like the echo of a story half-heard. One afternoon they found themselves alone in the barn, mending a busted wheel axle. Her fingers were covered in grease, her brow damp with sweat. You ever been to war? She asked, sudden and quiet. He nodded once. Served under Colonel Whitmore. Gettysburg mostly. My brother died in the Shenandoah. I'm sorry. He gave a shrug, but something in him tightened. Was a long time ago. She looked up, eyes unreadable. War's never just about time. It leaves things behind. That night, he sat on the porch while she played a tune on a harmonica she'd found in the bottom of an old trunk. The sound was raw, lonely, full of something that felt like memory. He said nothing. Just watched her, wondering how many versions of Eleanor Albright had existed before the one he married. Then came the day she shot the rattlesnake. Jed had been halfway to the corral when he heard the gunshot crack through the still air. By the time he reached the outhouse, Eleanor was standing with her revolver drawn, the snake's head a mangled mess in the dirt. She looked over her shoulder and smirked. Guess that's one snake that won't bite your behind. He blinked, then laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. The sound surprised even him. You're full of surprises, woman. You've seen about 3%. He believed it. But surprises turned to questions when Jed stumbled upon the letters. He'd been searching the office for an old land deed when he found them tucked inside the pages of a ledger, folded, worn, and tied together with a red ribbon. The top one was signed with a single letter, J. He wasn't proud of reading them, but he read every word. They weren't love letters, not exactly. They were warnings. Threats disguised as affection. Promises of a reunion Eleanor clearly wanted no part of. Words like belong and debt scratched across the paper like barbed wire. The next morning he waited for her at the edge of the paddock. "You got something you want to tell me?" he asked, holding the stack in one hand. Her eyes dropped to the ribbon. She didn't flinch. "I didn't write those," she said. "I kept them. To remember." "Remember what?" She took a long breath. "That I was property. Once." Jed's grip tightened on the letters. "Who is Jay?" "Jonas Rigg. Bounty hunter. Trafficker. Snake in a hat. He bought me when I was 17. A cold fury slid through Jed's chest. "Bought?" She nodded. "In New Orleans. My uncle owed a debt he couldn't pay. Sold me like a mule. Took me 2 years to escape. And now he's looking for you." Her eyes met his, steady and unafraid. "He always was." Jed didn't ask more. He didn't need to. The letters told him enough. Eleanor hadn't just survived something. She'd escaped someone who still believed he owned her. That night, a stranger rode through Bent Willow asking questions. Reese caught wind of it at the saloon and came back with word. Fella in a long coat. Tall. Scar on his cheek. Said he was looking for a woman named Eliza. Jed's heart hitched. "Eliza?" "Yeah." Said she might be traveling under a false name. Jed didn't go home right away. He sat at the edge of the dry creek bed, staring at the stars until the sky turned bruised purple. When he did return, Eleanor was standing in the yard, rifle slung across her back. Her hair whipped in the wind, loose and dark like the night around her. "He's here," she said. Jed swallowed. "You know for sure?" She nodded. "I know the way a wolf circles. He doesn't want to kill me. Not yet. He wants to break me again." Jed looked at her, really looked, and understood then that his feelings weren't born of pity or curiosity. Somewhere between the silence and the grit and the ghost notes of her harmonica, he'd fallen for her. "You ain't alone," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him like she didn't quite believe it. Or maybe she couldn't afford to. Before either of them could say more, a shot rang out in the distance. Jed ducked. Eleanor was already moving, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the dark. Another shot. Closer. The ranch erupted into chaos. Cattle stirred, dogs howled. One of the hands yelled, "Riders on the ridge." Jed ran for the barn. Eleanor was already scaling the ladder to the lookout point. She shouted, "We're under attack." Gunfire cracked again, this time slamming into the side of the chicken coop. A lantern shattered. Flames kissed the hay. Reese barreled out of the bunkhouse with a shotgun. Jed fired into the night, shouting orders, smoke burning his eyes. Then came the lull, 30 seconds of pure silence, broken only by the distant thunder of hoofbeats retreating. Jed ran to Eleanor. Her face was streaked with ash and sweat, but her hands didn't shake. "They were testing the perimeter," she said. "He's not coming alone." Jed stared into the night, heart hammering. "We need to leave," she added. "No. We fight." She turned to him, and in her eyes was something equal parts defiance and fear. "You don't know what he's capable of." Jed stepped closer. "I know what you are." That quieted her. A coyote howled in the distance. The fire in the coop crackled, casting shadows that danced like spirits. Eleanor looked down at the rifle in her hands. Then she met his eyes again. "I was never meant to stay anywhere," she said. "But I'm tired of running." Jed nodded. "Then we make our stand." She offered him a half smile, worn, cracked, and real. "Hope you shoot better than you flirt." He grinned back. "I've had more practice." They stood side by side in the dark, smoke curling around them, the scent of blood and fire in the air. Somewhere out there, Jonas Rigg was watching. Waiting. But so were they. The morning after the attack arrived colder than it had any right to be, the air heavy with smoke and tension. The fire had been doused, the damage minimal, but the silence that hung over Bent Willow Ranch wasn't the kind that promised peace. It was the kind that pressed on your chest, whispered in your ear, "He's not done yet." Jedediah stood in the yard, shotgun across his chest, boots planted in the blood-streaked dust. The carcass of a cow lay by the gate, throat slit, eyes wide open. A message plain as daylight. Reese knelt beside it. "They didn't even take the meat." "They didn't come to steal," Jed muttered. "They came to scare." "Well," Reese spat in the dirt, I'd say it worked. Half the hands are talking about leaving. Don't want to get caught in a war over a woman they barely know. Jed turned sharply. That woman's my wife. Reese raised both palms. Ain't me you need to convince. Inside the house, Eleanor packed a saddlebag. Methodical. Cold-eyed. She moved with a purpose Jed recognized too well, like a soldier dressing for battle. No hesitation. No wasted motion. You planning to ride out? He asked from the doorway. She didn't look up. He'll come again. With more men. If I'm gone, you've got a chance. No, Jed said, stepping in. That's not how we do this. You think this is noble? She snapped. It's suicide. I've faced worse than some bounty hunter. She stared at him, jaw clenched. This isn't about pride. He doesn't just kill Jed. He undoes. He'll twist your men against you. Make you doubt your own gut. That's how he wins. Jed came closer, voice low. Then let him try. Let him ride in here with the devil on his shoulder. I'd rather bleed beside you than watch your back disappear into the dust. That silenced her. Outside, Reese shouted. Jed and Eleanor bolted out the door. A riderless horse galloped in from the south. One of theirs, Gus's Palomino. Its flank was lathered in sweat, reins dangling, a crimson streak along its neck. Jed grabbed the reins, calmed it. He's in trouble. They tracked him by noon. Blood on the rocks. Boot prints that led through Red Gulch. Buzzards circled high overhead. When they found Gus, he was still breathing, but barely. He'd been beaten near to death. Left for the vultures. Jed knelt by his side, pressing cloth to the wound. Who did this? Gus coughed blood, eyes rolling. Man, in a duster. Black gloves. Said her name, like a hymn. Jed swallowed hard. Jonas. Gus nodded. He said she owed him more than blood. Jed felt Eleanor stiffen behind him. They got Gus back to the ranch. The doc from town did what he could, but the damage was done. Gus wouldn't ride again. And Jonas Rigg had made his intentions clear. That night, Eleanor stood outside the bunkhouse watching the stars. Jed joined her, the silence stretching between them like wire. I should have killed him when I had the chance, she whispered. You had the chance? She nodded slowly. After I escaped. A year later, I tracked him to a mining camp in Arizona. He was drunk. Alone. I had a gun to his back for 20 seconds. Jed looked at her. What stopped you? I wanted him to know. To live with the fact he couldn't break me. Now he wants to finish the job. She didn't reply. Jed reached for her hand. She let him take it. We ride at dawn, he said. You, me, Reese, whoever's got enough backbone left. We take the fight to him. Her grip tightened. I know where he'll be. Jonas Rigg didn't just ride into places, he infected them. Eleanor had learned to track him by scent, by the way towns bent around his presence like wind-warped trees. She named a place 2 valleys west, Crooked Tree, a dying mining outpost turned outlaw haven. They left before the sun broke. 6 riders. Jed, Eleanor, Reese, and 3 men stubborn or stupid enough to come along. They moved like ghosts, rifles strapped tight, nerves tighter. Crooked Tree rose from the desert like a scar. Boarded windows. Rusted signs. 1 saloon, 2 brothels, and a graveyard just as big. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Eleanor pulled her hat low. He's watching. Always watches first. Jed glanced at Reese. Keep the men close. Don't draw unless you see him. They dismounted and stepped inside the saloon. The air stank of whiskey and sweat. A piano played out of tune, and men looked up from their drinks with slow, appraising eyes. Behind the bar stood a woman with a shotgun and no patience. You looking for trouble? She asked, voice rough as sandpaper. We're looking for Jonas Rigg, Eleanor said. The saloon went still. The bartender's lip curled. Plenty of folks look for him. Most end up dead or wishing they were. Jed stepped forward. We ain't most. The doors behind them creaked open. Boots on wood. Jed turned, hand already near his holster. Jonas Rigg stood in the doorway like a man stepping into his own parlor. He wore a black duster, hat tilted low, scar slashing his cheek like a crooked grin. His eyes locked on Eleanor and lit with something vile, reverent and cruel. Well now, he drawled, if it ain't my runaway Rose. Jed stepped between them. She ain't yours. Jonas chuckled. She's whatever she chooses to be, I suppose. But she left me with an itch I've been needin' to scratch. Eleanor's voice was ice. The only thing you're gettin' is a bullet. Reese dove sideways. Jed fired. Chaos exploded. Jonas rolled behind a table. His men burst through windows and doors, at least 8 of them. The saloon turned into a thunderstorm of gunpowder and screams. Jed ducked behind the bar, glass shattering overhead. He fired once, twice, dropped a man trying to flank Reese. Eleanor had disappeared. For a moment, Jed panicked, until he spotted her silhouette upstairs above the rafters. She moved like a shadow, silent and sure, rifle aimed. She fired. Jonas's second-in-command dropped like a stone. Jonas snarled, eyes searching for her. "You're still mine, Eliza," he shouted. She stepped forward from the upper balcony. Not anymore. Her shot hit his shoulder. He staggered back, teeth bared. Jed rushed him. The two collided near the swinging doors, crashing into the street. They fought in the dust, fists and blood and rage. Jonas grabbed a knife. Jed caught his wrist, twisted. The blade dropped. Then Eleanor was there. Rifle trained. Voice steady. "Do it," Jonas growled, spitting blood. "Finish it." She hesitated. Jed coughed, face bloody. "Don't give him another second." Jonas laughed, eyes wild. "You won't. That's the joke. You never could." Eleanor stepped forward. "You're right." She swung the rifle like a club. The butt cracked against his skull. He went limp. Breathing hard, she knelt beside him, pressing the barrel to his temple. Jed watched, not stopping her. Not this time. But she didn't pull the trigger. "I want you to live with this," she whispered. "To know I beat you." She stood. Jed stared at her, heart pounding. "You let him go?" he asked. "No," she said, stepping back. "I just didn't kill him." Behind them, Reese limped out of the saloon. "Is it over?" Jed looked at Eleanor. "Not yet," she said. "But we're close." They left Jonas bleeding in the street. The law would come, eventually. Or the desert would take him. Either way, he'd never chase her again. On the ride home, Eleanor rode beside Jed, hat tilted low, rifle strapped to her back. He glanced over. "You did what you had to." She looked forward. "I did what I could live with." They rode in silence, the trail winding like a scar through the dust. But ahead, the sky was clear, and the wind carried no smoke. The fire that consumed Bent Willow Ranch was born in a night as dark as any storm could summon. The moon hung high, a pale witness to the violence that boiled in the blood of men who had never been taught how to leave things behind. For the last 3 weeks they had rested, no longer on the offensive but waiting. Watching. Like the calm before a thunderstrike, it stretched long and taut, ready to break. Jedediah stood at the edge of the creek, staring into the rippling water, the reflection of the trees blurring in the current. He hadn't seen his wife since dawn. She'd gone off toward the ridge, tracking something he didn't ask about. It wasn't like Eleanor to just disappear without a word. But he knew better than to question her, not when she wore that look in her eyes, determined, unreadable, like a storm she couldn't outrun. It wasn't until the shout came that he knew the storm was already here. Fire. Reese's voice echoed through the night air, frantic, as though the very word might conjure the flames themselves. Jed spun toward the sound, heart pounding, adrenaline surging in his veins. He didn't wait. He ran fast as he could toward the barn, toward the smoke curling up into the sky, thick and black. The ranch was already ablaze. The wind howled through the dry grasses, feeding the flames, lifting them higher and higher, their orange tongues licking at the horizon. The men who had been left to watch the stock were already pulling water from the well, working in desperate silence. But it wasn't enough. Eleanor was standing at the barn's entrance, eyes fierce, her rifle in her hand, a thin trail of smoke curling from her lips as she exhaled. "They're here," she said, her voice low and calm despite the inferno. "Jonas sent them." Jed didn't need to ask who they were. He knew. He'd been waiting for this moment. Waiting for the enemy to show themselves one final time. But there was something else in her eyes, something wild, something that hadn't been there before. "Where are the others?" he asked, moving toward her, trying to keep his voice steady. "Out there," she said, pointing toward the far side of the property, where shadows moved in the distance. "But we can't fight this fire. Not with what we have." Jed cursed under his breath. "We're not running." "No," she agreed, meeting his gaze with something stronger than resolve. "We're fighting." They fought the fire like soldiers, like survivors. But it was clear the ranch wasn't going to make it. The flames consumed everything, barns, fences, haystacks, until there was nothing left but charred earth. And yet, through it all, they fought back the panic, trying to hold their ground, trying to protect the land that had become their home. By the time the first of Jonas Riggs' men appeared, they had already lost the battle with the fire. But the real battle was only beginning. Jed and Eleanor stood side by side, rifles raised, eyes scanning the night for movement. The air was thick with smoke, their lungs burning with each breath. Then a shot rang out. And another. Reese went down first, his leg buckling beneath him as the bullet tore through his calf. "Get to cover," he shouted, though his voice was strained with pain. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She was already moving, crouching low behind a stack of timber, her rifle aimed at the dark figures advancing through the smoke. "I'll hold them off," she called to Jed. "Get the others." Jed didn't question her. He moved to help Reese, pulling him toward the barn, every step a struggle against the weight of the flames, the smoke, the chaos. It was as if the earth itself was fighting back. Behind them, Eleanor fired again, the sharp crack of the rifle cutting through the roar of the fire. Jonas Rigg's men were moving fast now, and Jed could see the glint of steel in the firelight, sabers, knives, and pistols drawn, all aimed at the ranch. They weren't here to take cattle. They were here for blood. The first man came charging through the smoke, silhouetted against the flames. Jed raised his rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, a bullet slammed into the side of his chest, knocking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, blood seeping from the wound. But his mind was sharp, and he knew that the game wasn't over yet. He scrambled behind a pile of crates, struggling to catch his breath, his heart hammering in his ears. He could hear Eleanor's voice, strong, determined, cutting through the night. But there was no time to think about her now. The men were coming for him. He fired. A flash of light. Another man dropped, clutching his shoulder, but the others kept coming, advancing like a wave, relentless, unyielding. For a moment, Jed thought they might not make it out alive. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw her, Eleanor, her silhouette cutting through the smoke, rifle raised, her movements a blur of power and precision. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She was everything Jed had known her to be, and everything she had been hiding for so long. She was the storm. Eleanor's shot rang out, and another man fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. She didn't stop. She kept firing, her eyes sharp, tracking every movement, calculating every shot. Her rage, her grief, it all came pouring out in a fury of gunfire and smoke. She was no longer the woman who'd lived in the shadows. She was no longer running. Jed pulled himself to his feet, gritting his teeth against the pain. The bullet wound in his side throbbed, but he ignored it, his focus locked on the task ahead. He could see Reese lying motionless behind the barn, but he couldn't afford to go to him, not yet. Another gunshot rang out, and Jonas Rigg appeared, stepping into the firelight like a man made of shadows. He stood tall, dark eyes glinting with cold malice. He surveyed the scene with an almost casual indifference, as if they were nothing more than cattle to be slaughtered. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, rifle aimed steady, the look in her eyes something fierce, something unbroken. "You," Jonas spat, his voice a low growl. "I knew you'd come crawling back. Thought you could leave me, but you never could. You're still mine." Eleanor's lips curled into a cold, dangerous smile. "I'm not yours, Jonas. And I never will be." Jonas laughed, drawing his pistol. "You should have stayed gone. You should have stayed dead." The fight exploded in a split second, Jonas's gunfire cutting through the air, but Eleanor was faster. She shot first, the bullet tearing through his arm. He stumbled, his pistol dropping to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief. She was already there, moving in close, a cold fury in her every step. Without a word, she kicked his gun away, her eyes never leaving his face. Jonas Rigg was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. "You lost," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady, but the fire in her eyes told a different story. "You lost everything." And with that, she raised her rifle one last time, steadying her breath. The shot rang out, and Jonas Rigg crumpled to the ground, his body falling like a broken puppet. Silence. The flames crackled, the last embers of the fire flickering in the night. Jed watched her, his heart pounding, the weight of everything they had fought for, everything they had survived, settling in his chest. She turned to him, her face streaked with soot, her expression unreadable. "We won," she whispered. And for the first time, Jed realized that it wasn't just the fire that had burned. It was everything they'd been through. Every wound. Every loss. Every bit of darkness that had once kept them apart. And now, with Jonas Rigg lying dead in the dirt, it was finally over. They stood there, side by side, in the aftermath of a battle they had never thought they would win. But they had, and the fire had burned itself out. There was nothing left to fear. And nothing left to run from. The end. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged town of Salt Creek, its dusty streets the veins of a place worn down by time and lawlessness. Jesse Walker rode his horse through the main street, his face shaded beneath the brim of his wide hat, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. His mind was elsewhere, far from the heat of the afternoon, far from the whispers of the past that had been chasing him for years. He'd been out of the game for months now, a quiet life in the middle of nowhere, the only thing that kept him going. No more killing. No more running. No more living in the shadow of men like Hank Coulter. But the Wild West never let a man leave so easily. Jesse had barely noticed the commotion until the gunfire rang out. The first shot shattered the afternoon silence like glass, followed by the sharp crack of another. A man fell in the street just ahead, his body crumpling in a cloud of dust. A crowd screamed, scattering in every direction like rabbits caught in a brush fire. Jesse's instincts kicked in before he could think, and he spurred his horse forward. It was a mistake really to get involved. The gunfight wasn't meant for him, but it was his to deal with now. He pulled his revolver, its cold steel familiar in his hand, and pushed his horse into the fray. His thoughts were singular: survive. He had done it before 1,000 times, and he would do it again if it meant getting out of here alive. His body moved with the sharp, practiced precision of a man who had spent too many years in this life, but his heart? That had been locked away in a place he'd sworn to never revisit. A scream tore through the chaos, a woman's voice, high and desperate. Jesse's head snapped toward the sound. There, at the corner of the saloon, a woman stood frozen, her face pale with terror. Two men, their faces obscured by bandanas, approached her. One of them laughed as he raised his gun, aiming straight for her chest. Without thinking, Jesse was off his horse, his boots pounding the dirt as he sprinted toward the scene. His revolver flashed, a single shot that rang out sharp and true, the first outlaw falling with a gasp. But the second man was quicker. The gunman swung around, firing just as Jesse reached the woman. He felt a searing pain slice across his arm, but his shot didn't falter. The second man dropped like a sack of flour. For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the ringing in Jesse's ears as he staggered forward, his legs weakening beneath him. His hand clutched his bleeding arm, but he didn't stop. Not yet. Get down, he shouted at the woman, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. She stood there, her wide, fearful eyes locked on him. He saw the way her hands shook, the way she pressed herself back against the wall, as if she could blend into it and disappear. Now, he growled, his voice taking on a rougher edge. This wasn't the time to question, to wonder. He was a man who acted before his brain caught up with the situation. The woman didn't move. Jesse was used to people being paralyzed by fear, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. She wasn't just scared. She was trapped. In one fluid motion, he reached out and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to the ground just as another shot rang out, grazing the corner of the building behind them. He shoved her into the dirt, keeping her head down. Stay low, he ordered, though it was more of a command than a suggestion. She nodded, though it was clear her thoughts were elsewhere. Her breaths were shallow, rapid. Jesse glanced around. The crowd had dispersed, but the danger wasn't over. They were still too exposed. Come on, he muttered, pulling her to her feet and hauling her toward the alley. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he cared enough to keep her alive, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was the way she'd frozen in place, unable to protect herself, as though she didn't know how. Whatever it was, it kept him from walking away. He wasn't the hero type, not anymore. But something inside him rebelled against the idea of leaving her to die. The alley was dark and quiet, the sounds of gunfire still echoing in the distance. Jesse shoved the woman behind a stack of crates, pressing his back to the cold wood of the building. He winced, feeling the blood drip down his arm. He didn't have time to tend to it. The woman was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had a thin, fragile look to her, sharp, intelligent eyes, and dark hair that had been pulled into a tight bun, strands already slipping free. She wasn't the typical damsel, though. That much Jesse could tell. Her eyes flickered to his wound, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. It was clear from the way she looked at him that she understood he was the one keeping her alive now. She owed him. And Jesse wasn't sure he wanted to collect that debt. But the situation didn't give him the luxury of choice. You're not safe here, he said, his voice low and steady. You need to get out of town. Go west, toward the river. It's your best chance. She met his gaze, a faint flicker of recognition in her eyes. I can't, she said quietly. My father? She stopped herself, biting her lip. Jesse narrowed his eyes. What about your father? I don't have anyone else. The words came out in a rush, as though she was struggling to keep herself together. Her chin quivered slightly, but she didn't cry. She wasn't the type, not yet. Jesse exhaled sharply, his hand pressing harder against his wound as blood continued to seep through his fingers. "Fine," he said, his voice more gruff than he intended. "You're sticking with me then. For now." The woman's eyes widened, but before she could protest, Jesse held up a hand. "Don't argue. We're better off together. If you want to survive, you stick close to me. Understand?" She hesitated for a moment as though weighing her options, then nodded. "You're lucky I was around," Jesse added, though there was no pride in his voice. His words were the simple truth. The Wild West wasn't a place for charity. The woman's gaze flickered to the street, the sounds of the gunfight slowly dying down, replaced by the quiet buzz of the town settling back into its ordinary chaos. But for her, nothing would ever be the same. "We'll need to get out of here before those men come looking for us," Jesse said, turning toward the alley's exit. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." And with that, he pulled her into motion again, away from the chaos of the town and into an uncertain future. What began as a chance encounter, a random act of heroism, would soon twist into something far more dangerous, and far more complicated, than either of them could have ever imagined. The days following the gunfight felt like a slow, grinding passage through a storm. Salt Creek, with its barren streets and the endless rustle of dry wind, seemed to wear down the edges of the soul. Jesse Walker had never been one to stay in one place long enough to feel the weight of time, but now it seemed to drag behind him like a shadow, no matter how far he tried to outrun it. He had taken Emily, the woman he'd saved, to a small cabin just outside of town, a place where no one would find them, where the noise of the outside world wouldn't reach them. It was rough, barely more than a shack, but it was safe for the moment. The roof creaked in the wind, and the walls seemed to shudder with every gust, but it was a roof. It was shelter. And for that, Jesse was grateful. But Emily was not. She barely spoke as they settled into the cramped space. The fire in the corner crackled and hissed, casting long shadows on the walls, and Jesse sat with his back to the door, his revolver resting within arm's reach. He watched her carefully. She hadn't said much since they arrived, her wide eyes constantly darting to the corners of the room, as though she expected someone to burst in at any moment. Jesse didn't blame her for being on edge. After all, she'd nearly died that afternoon, and he had dragged her out of the chaos without so much as a thank you. But he wasn't the type to indulge in pleasantries. His wounds were slow to heal, but it wasn't the bleeding that bothered him, it was the gnawing emptiness in his chest that seemed to grow every time he looked at her. She had her own demons, though. He could see it in the way she carried herself. Her shoulders were always hunched, like a woman who had learned to bear weight she shouldn't have had to. Her hands, though delicate and pale, were calloused from years of hard work. "Are you just gonna stare at me all night, or are you gonna say something?" Her voice was quiet, edged with something that might have been frustration or fear. Either way, it was a change from the silence. Jesse shrugged, not looking at her as he leaned back against the wall. "I don't have much to say." "You saved my life," she replied, her words heavy with the weight of that simple fact. "And you don't even want to talk about it?" He met her gaze then, and for a moment, something flickered between them, an understanding, however brief, that neither of them was willing to articulate. But Jesse was a man of action, not words, and the silence between them deepened. "Doesn't matter now," he said, his voice low and harsh. "We're here. You're safe. That's all that counts." Emily scoffed, shaking her head as she stood and moved to the window. She stared out into the darkened landscape beyond, where the barren hills stretched into the distance like a wasteland, empty and unforgiving. The wind whispered through the trees, a soft, mournful sound. "You think just being safe is enough?" she asked, her back still to him. "You think you can just save me, stick me in some cabin, and forget about everything that's happened? We're not just here to survive, Jesse. We're here because something went wrong. Because you're running from something. And so am I." He didn't answer at first, just watched her from his place by the fire. He hadn't expected her to open up, but there it was, the crack in her armor. For a moment, he considered pushing her back into her silence. She was a stranger after all, a woman he barely knew. But something about the way she stood there, so broken and vulnerable, made him pause. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's the hand I've been dealt. You think I'm running from something? Hell, I'm not running from anything anymore. I'm just trying to stay alive." Her laugh was dry, bitter. Stay alive? By what? Hiding in the dirt, waiting for the world to come knocking. He didn't flinch at her words. "You got a better idea?" Emily turned then, her eyes blazing with something fierce and untamed. "Maybe I do. But I'm stuck here with you, aren't I? No way to get back to town, No way to escape whatever it is that's chasing us. You think you can just ride this out, Jesse, but there's more to it than that. The past doesn't let you forget, and neither do the people you've crossed. Jesse stood then, his muscles sore from the ride and the wounds that had yet to heal. He stepped closer to her, his face hardening as he narrowed the distance between them. Don't start thinking you know me. You don't. And I don't know you. She didn't back down. Her chin lifted defiantly, the firelight dancing in her eyes. I don't need to know you. I just need to survive. That's all I'm asking for. You say we're both here to stay alive, but you don't understand. I don't just need to survive anymore. I need something more. For a long moment they stood there, inches apart. The tension between them was palpable, as if the weight of their own fears and desires was pressing in on both of them. Jesse's breath was shallow, his hand twitching toward his gun, not out of threat but from an instinct that had been sharpened over the years. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and sudden, a reminder that the outside world was never far away. Jesse's hand went to his gun in an instant, his body coiled like a spring. Stay quiet, he whispered to Emily, his voice commanding. She nodded, her face pale, but she didn't argue. Jesse stepped to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Whoever was out there wasn't supposed to know about the cabin. Not yet. But the knock came again, insistent, the sound of something dangerous lurking just beyond the threshold. He slowly pulled open the door, his gun at the ready. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness of the night, was a man Jesse had hoped never to see again. Hank Coulter, Jesse muttered under his breath, the name tasting like bitter ashes on his tongue. Hank grinned, his smile cold and knowing. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a little reunion. Jesse's eyes flickered to Emily, who stood just behind him, her face stricken with a fear she hadn't shown before. The past had come knocking, and this time, it wasn't just Jesse who had to face it. Looks like trouble's found us, Jesse said softly, the weight of his past and his future crashing down on him in that moment. Emily's heart raced, her body stiff with tension, as Hank's voice sliced through the air like a blade. You're not getting away that easy, Jesse. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rattling the door behind Jesse, but he didn't flinch. His gaze never left Hank Coulter's cold, calculating eyes. The man standing in front of him was a ghost from the past, a specter that had haunted Jesse's every move, every decision. He knew it wasn't a coincidence that Hank had shown up now. He'd been waiting, lurking for the right moment to strike. Emily's breath caught behind him, a soft, barely audible sound, but Jesse heard it. He felt it like a stab to his gut, the realization that the danger wasn't just his to face anymore. She was caught in this whether she liked it or not. Get inside, Jesse ordered, his voice low but firm. His hand remained on the revolver tucked against his side, his finger brushing the trigger guard in a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't want to shoot Hank, not yet, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Every second stretched long, tight, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Hank stepped into the doorway without invitation, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, the creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. Always the stubborn one, Jesse, he said, his voice rough and smooth all at once, like gravel scraping against leather. I thought you'd learn by now. There's no running from me. Jesse didn't back up. He didn't even shift. He just stood there, blocking the entrance with his body, as if he could stop the flood that was about to hit with sheer willpower alone. But even he knew that wasn't possible. Leave, Hank, Jesse said, his voice colder now, edged with the years of bitterness that had settled deep in his bones. This is between you and me. I'm not dragging anyone else into it. Hank's lips curled into a smile, slow and dangerous. Oh, but you already have. She's a part of this now whether you want it or not. You never could stay out of trouble, Jesse. Always dragging good folks into the mess you make. Jesse's heart thudded harder in his chest. He didn't want to think about Emily's involvement, didn't want to think about her getting caught in the web of his past. But Hank's words had a weight to them, a truth that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. It was too late to protect her. Emily stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear, her hands trembling ever so slightly at her sides. Who is he? She asked, her voice fragile but demanding, like she had the right to know now. And she did. She had every right. Jesse didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. How could he explain the man who had once been both a mentor and a nightmare? A man who had shaped Jesse into the cold, distant outlaw he'd become, before tearing his life apart when Jesse had dared to try and walk away? Hank's gaze flickered over to Emily, then back to Jesse, his smirk widening. She doesn't know? You didn't tell her? How predictable. His eyes glinted with malicious amusement as he took a step closer, forcing Jesse to shift just an inch. That was all Hank needed, just enough to remind him who held the power. Jesse and I have history, Hank continued, his tone now casual, almost friendly. History that stretches back to days neither of us are proud of. But, you know, it's never too late to make things right, is it, Jesse? Jesse's jaw tightened, his muscles coiled with the old rage that Hank's words always sparked. This wasn't the man who'd saved his life. This was a reminder of everything Jesse had tried to outrun, tried to bury deep enough that no one could find it. But Hank had found it, like a vulture circling over a carcass, and now he was here to pick it clean. You don't get to walk into my life and make demands, Hank, Jesse growled, every word a battle. Hank's laugh was a deep, rich sound, the kind that made Jesse's skin crawl. Oh, I think I do. You've got a debt, Jesse. A debt you've been running from for a long time. You can hide out here all you want, but sooner or later it catches up. Jesse's grip tightened on the revolver at his side, but his fingers stayed loose, controlled. He wouldn't let the fear take over. He wouldn't let Hank see it because Hank always fed on fear. It was the one thing Jesse could never afford to show him. I'm done with you, Hank, Jesse said, his voice deadly quiet. I don't owe you anything. But Hank just smiled again, that same chilling, knowing smile. You don't owe me anything? That's funny. I'm sure your old friends would disagree. The mention of friends hit Jesse like a fist to the gut. Old debts. Old wounds. The men he'd once ridden with. Men who had turned on him the moment the law started to breathe down their necks. Jesse had walked away, yes, but not without consequences. Hank knew exactly where to strike, and he did it without hesitation. Emily stood frozen, taking in the exchange, her eyes darting between the two men. She was trying to piece it together, trying to understand the tension that crackled in the air. But she couldn't. Not yet. The silence stretched longer this time, thick and suffocating, as Hank waited for Jesse to break. When Jesse didn't, Hank took a step back and let out a heavy sigh. All right, Jesse, Hank said, his voice suddenly cold. I'll make this simple. You come back with me and you settle up your debt. You've been running long enough. Or you can stay here, hide away like a coward. But you know I won't let you hide forever. The past always finds you. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest. Hank was offering him a choice, but it wasn't really a choice, not in any meaningful way. Going back meant facing the men he had betrayed, and Hank would make sure of that. Staying here meant facing Hank's wrath, his men's vengeance. Either way, Jesse was caught in a trap of his own making. But as the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's fragile walls, Jesse felt the weight of his decision settle in his chest. He couldn't outrun this. Not anymore. He turned to Emily then, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the street, he felt the full weight of his responsibility toward her. She had no part in this, no part in his past. But she was here now. And she wasn't going anywhere. I'll go, Jesse said, his voice steady, though every part of him screamed to fight, to resist. But not for you. Hank's smirk faltered just for a second, but then it was back, that same smug confidence. Fine by me, Hank said, his tone a mockery of civility. But don't think you've got the upper hand, Jesse. You're already in too deep. Jesse didn't answer. He couldn't. The storm had finally broken, and all that was left was the mess it had made. Jesse's decision to face Hank had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth, but there was no turning back. The moment he stepped outside, the cold desert air bit into him, a reminder that nothing in this life was free. Not freedom. Not safety. Nothing. As he mounted his horse, Emily watched him from the doorway of the cabin, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken since he'd made his choice, but the weight of her gaze lingered, as though she were seeing him for the first time, seeing the man who would choose to walk right into the storm instead of running from it. Hank stood a few paces ahead, his stance relaxed, almost too casual for someone who had just demanded another man's life be held in his hands. The wind tugged at his long coat, but he didn't flinch, the kind of man who'd made peace with his own darkness a long time ago. The two of them had been through too much together, too much blood spilled, too many friends lost, to believe there was anything simple about their encounter now. We're headed to town, Hank said, his tone flat but laced with that same dangerous amusement. Better make sure you're ready. You might have to face more than just me before the day's done. Jesse didn't respond. He didn't need to. The town was where everything had started, where everything would end. He had known this day would come sooner or later. But the question that still clawed at him was whether or not he would survive it. The debts he owed, the men he'd crossed, it all led back to Salt Creek, back to the people who had once trusted him and the people he had betrayed. As they rode in silence, the landscape around them seemed to stretch on forever. The dry, cracked earth underfoot seemed to echo the emptiness in Jesse's chest, a place that had once been filled with ideals and dreams, but was now hollowed out by the choices he'd made. He thought of Emily again, standing in the doorway, her expression so full of uncertainty. She had no place in this fight, no reason to be involved. Yet here she was, tangled in his past, and it felt like a weight he couldn't shake. The ride to town took longer than Jesse would have liked, each mile stretching out in front of him like a test of his resolve. Hank kept the distance between them at a comfortable length, not offering any further conversation, but Jesse could feel the tension building in the air. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the slow, creeping anticipation of violence. By the time they reached Salt Creek, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The town had changed since Jesse had last been there. Buildings that were once bustling with life now sat in silence, windows shattered, storefronts abandoned. The law had gotten to it, and so had the outlaws. There were fewer people walking the streets, and those who did move quickly, keeping their heads down, as though the very presence of Jesse Walker brought a kind of curse with it. Hank dismounted without a word, his boots thudding against the dry earth. "The sheriff's office is up ahead," he said, glancing back at Jesse. "You're not walking out of this, Jesse? Not without answering for what you've done." Jesse followed him, his mind racing. He knew this game too well. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the power Hank had over the town. Hank had set things in motion long ago, and now he had all the pieces in place to bring Jesse down. And he wasn't going to let him leave without extracting every last ounce of satisfaction. They reached the sheriff's office, and Hank stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the doorframe. Jesse hesitated for just a moment before following. The building smelled of stale smoke and whiskey, a mix of old memories and newer sins. Inside, a few men sat at a table, cards spread out before them, their faces grim. They didn't look up as Jesse entered, but their eyes followed him, full of recognition, full of judgment. The sheriff was seated behind his desk, his face weathered and lined with the years. He had once been a man of honor, a man Jesse had respected. But that was a lifetime ago. Now the sheriff's eyes only held suspicion, disdain. "Jesse Walker," the sheriff said, his voice low and bitter. "I thought I might see you again someday." "You don't need to worry about me, Sheriff," Jesse replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm here to settle my debts. Nothing more." Hank leaned against the wall, arms crossed, enjoying the scene. "Settle your debts? You think you can just waltz in here and make things right? You've been running from your past for far too long, Jesse. You think you can hide behind that good guy act?" Jesse's eyes flickered to Hank, then back to the sheriff. "I've got no excuse for what I've done. But I'll face it. It's time." The sheriff didn't respond right away. He just stared at Jesse as if weighing his words, considering the man standing before him. Finally, after a long silence, he stood up from his chair and moved to the front of the desk. "Did you think coming back here would make things right?" the sheriff asked, his voice rough but with an edge of regret. "You've hurt a lot of good people, Jesse. And now you want to fix it? You think it's that simple?" Jesse swallowed hard, his throat tight with the years of guilt he'd buried so deep. "No, I don't think it's simple. But I'm done running." There was another long pause, and then the sheriff sighed. "You want redemption? It doesn't work like that, son. You can't just walk back into the world and expect it to forget everything you've done. Some debts, some things you can't fix." Jesse's hands clenched into fists, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing on him harder than he expected. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. "I'm not asking for redemption," he said quietly. "I'm just asking for the chance to make it right." The sheriff seemed to consider this for a long moment before nodding, almost imperceptibly. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, as if everyone knew what was coming, but no one was quite ready to face it. Hank, sensing that things were beginning to turn in Jesse's favor, pushed off from the wall and stepped forward. "This ain't over, Jesse," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you've paid your dues? You've barely scratched the surface." Before Jesse could respond, the door burst open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the small room. A few men entered, their eyes cold and hungry, like wolves closing in on their prey. The final confrontation had begun. In that instant, everything Jesse had been running from collided with everything he had hoped to escape. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every choice he had made, every life he had touched, and every person he had betrayed. There was no more hiding. No more running. As the first punch was thrown, Jesse realized that redemption wasn't something you could claim by just showing up. It was something you fought for. And for the first time in years he felt the fire of that fight burn deep within him. The storm had broken. And now it was time to face the wreckage.